Chapter 237. Nancy's aunt, Roan Drew, patted her shoulder and said in a displeased tone, "Why are you screaming? How old are you now? You're not seeing anyone right now. So I'll introduce a young entrepreneur from our town to you today. He owns a food factory, and his family has assets worth up to $10 million. Don't you think he's good enough for you?" Nancy's mother, May Brand, agreed and said, "She's right, Nancy. He has a nice family and has good looks too. We've checked him out for you." Her father, Joshua Brand, seemed earnest, keeping quiet the entire time. There was no way Nancy would accept it. She quickly said, "I don't want to date anyone yet. Wilbur, stop the car now. I'm not going." She had no idea that the lunch would turn out to be a blind date. She did not want to do it, and Wilbur was around too. She felt so ashamed that she wanted to crawl inside a hole. Wilbur felt awkward too. He did not know whether he should stop the car or not. It was her family business, after all. Roan yelled, "Driver, don't listen to her. We're in charge today. We spent days making plans for you. How could you refuse to go just like that?" He helplessly drove at a slow pace. Nancy wanted to resist and gave a lot of excuses, but her mother and her aunt had made up their minds. They forced her to go no matter what. They were not far from the city, so they had arrived while the argument was ongoing. Ron instructed Wilbur to park in front of a restaurant and then dragged Nancy out of the car. Her parents then quickly got out of the car too. Joshua told Wilbur in a friendly manner, "Kid, you should eat with us too." I don't think so. It won't be appropriate." He chuckled wryly. It was not appropriate for a mere driver to take part in a blind date. However, Nancy yelled, "Come here, Wilbur. You have to join this one." She felt a mix of conflicting emotions going crazy inside her at that moment. She wanted to use the excuse of returning to their hometown to invite him to have lunch at her place. She knew it was not possible for her to start a relationship with him, but she subconsciously still wanted to be with Wilbur. The unexpected arrangement caught her off guard, so she felt very annoyed. What would become of them if Wilbur was cast aside? How could she ever face him again? Wilbur noticed how determined she looked and sounded, so he had no choice but to get out of the car and walk toward her. Roan sized him up with a confused gaze. Then, she looked at Nancy again. She whispered, "What is your relationship with him?" "He's my colleague," replied Nancy in a displeased tone. She knew that his identity should not be revealed so easily. Chelsea and Miss Eve warned her before. The two women were her real supervisors, and they decided the fate of her job. Roan frowned and asked, "Isn't he just a driver? What are you up to?" "He's my colleague. I went along with the ride in his car." Nancy tried her best not to further the misunderstanding. Perhaps her aunt and her mom would cancel the blind date because of that, so she insisted he was her colleague. Roan thought about it and looked like she had a realization. She grinned and said, "You don't want to attend the blind date, so you're trying to trick me, right?" "I wasn't planning to," Nancy replied. Roan scoffed and said, "We just want what's good for you. Also, you're a general manager now. So how can you not own a new car? You lived in the city for a few years, and now you're trying to fool us like this. We're your family, you know." Roan's analysis made Nancy feel speechless. Wilbur was similarly dumbfounded. Roan truly had a wild imagination. She dragged Nancy into the restaurant regardless of her protests. Chapter 238. Joshua also tugged Wilbur along, so he had no choice but to follow them. A few moments later, they were in a room that was clearly reserved. They took their seats, and Nancy intentionally sat next to Wilbur. Roan rolled her eyes in annoyance and also glared at Wilbur. Wilbur felt awkward. He sat next to Nancy like he was in danger, and he was not saying a word. What else could he do? Nancy would not let him leave, but if he stayed, Roan would be glaring daggers at him. That was his only option. Suddenly, the waitress served them drinks. He hurriedly stood up and poured water for everyone to relieve the awkward tension. He asked, "Why isn't the entrepreneur here yet?" In the case of blind dates, the guy would usually arrive earlier and be prepared for it. Why was it the girl's family making the arrangement to wait for the guy instead for this blind date? Roan rolled her eyes as soon as he asked that, then replied, "What do you know? He's an entrepreneur, so he's very busy." "Oh, I see. Wilbur held back from laughing. He took a sip of water after serving everyone. Suddenly, Roan said to Nancy, Nancy, you're living in the city now and you're a successful general manager. However, he's not doing so badly either. Leaving his $10 million of family assets aside, his uncle is the person in charge of our town. He does whatever he pleases because he's in charge here. It won't hurt you if you end up with him. Wilbur suddenly understood the situation and shot a look at Nancy at the same time. Nancy was not tall, but she was petite and pretty. She had a stunning figure too. She was considered beautiful by most women's standards and was more than enough for mediocre partners. Wilbur decided to take it easy at that moment. He could not avoid the situation, so he might as well enjoy the spectacle. It did not matter whether Nancy accepted it or not. It was her personal matter, and it had nothing to do with him. He felt relaxed. He pushed her cup towards her, then smiled and said, Miss Brand, you should check him out before you judge him. What if he's really nice? Perhaps he can be an option for you. What did you say? Nancy glared at Wilbur, but she felt like it was inappropriate for her to do that, so she hurriedly turned the other way. She knew that he was in charge of Willow Corp and Cape. His wealth was immeasurable. The entrepreneur they were meeting was a joke in Wilbur's eyes. She was instantly upset that Wilbur would make fun of her like that. She knew that it was impossible for her to end up with Wilbur because Chelsea and Faye were much more powerful than she is. However, she still felt jealous to hear him say that. At the same time, she also felt disappointed. He suddenly realized that it was not the right thing to say. He wanted to explain, but Roan chimed in. Look, your driver is right. You shouldn't be stuck up just because you stayed in the city for a few years. It's important to stay humble. Nancy took a sip of her water, then suddenly snarled and replied, You're right, Aunt Roan. Roan instantly turned into all smiles. Wilbur fell silent. He picked up his beverage and drank it in silence. He knew that Nancy did that on purpose, but he could not do anything about it. The waitress opened the door at that point, and a man walked in with a bright smile. I'm sorry, everyone. I had some work at the office, which is why I'm late. My apologies. Wilbur sized him up. He was in his 30s and was good looking. He was wearing luxury brand clothes while holding a bag. His entire outfit looked very uncomfortable. Roan hurriedly stood up and introduced him. This is the general manager of Harvest Food Factory, Jason Yates. Come and have a seat, Mr. Yates. Jason nodded and glanced at Nancy. His expression turned into one of surprise. He was pleasantly surprised. However, he was not pleased to see Wilbur sitting next to Nancy. Chapter 239. Roan noticed that, so she quickly explained. This is Nancy's driver. He drove her all the way here, so she insisted he join us for lunch. Oh. Jason nodded slowly. He sat across from Nancy and Wilbur and tossed his bag on the table. Waitress, please serve the food, yelled Roan. However, Jason waved it off and said, There's no rush. All right. No need to rush. Roan hurriedly stopped the waitress. Jason smiled. He looked at Nancy and asked, You must be Miss Nancy Brand, the general manager, right? It's just a title. I'm just an employee working for someone else, replied Nancy nonchalantly. Jason asked again, I heard that you were promoted to the general manager of Willow Corp recently, right? He chuckled and said, Willow Corp is a major enterprise. Unlike my enterprise from a small town like ours, there's only so much room for it to grow. You're considered young and successful, Mr. Yates, replied Nancy. He smiled, then turned to look at Wilbur. He frowned and said, Miss Brand, we're both successful people. And we have personal matters here. Isn't it inappropriate to have a driver joining us at this table? Jason did not know why, but he felt very uncomfortable seeing Wilbur next to Nancy. He could not tell if the feelings he had toward Wilbur were hate or something else, but he definitely felt annoyed. Nancy frowned and asked, What's wrong with it? Miss Brand, I don't mind this, but my uncle knows it's an important day for me. So he's coming over as soon as he's done with his meeting. You know, people like us prioritize qualifications and status. Be it dining or having a meeting, you can't allow a driver to sit with my uncle. I'm afraid my uncle will be quite upset, said Jason. Roan immediately beamed and asked, Is your uncle coming too? That's wonderful. We rarely get to see him. Today truly is a marvelous day. My uncle cares about me too, otherwise, my enterprise wouldn't be the best in this town. Jason looked at Wilbur arrogantly. Wilbur picked up his drink to hold back his laughter. Rowan laughed and said, "You're right. Say, driver, you should eat outside." "Don't worry, the meal is on us," Rowan said. Wilbur nodded because he could not sit there any longer. Jason was just too funny. Wilbur was afraid that he would burst out laughing and make things awkward. However, Nancy said, "I invited him here, so he must eat with me." She would never allow Wilbur to be insulted like that. She ignored her family and instantly rejected the demand. Wilbur felt awkward. He looked at Nancy and whispered, "It's the same if I eat outside. You're finally home, so don't make your family unhappy." "No, you have to listen to me on this one," she insisted. Wilbur shrugged and looked at Rowan helplessly. Rowan was upset and asked, "What are you doing, Nancy? He's just a driver. Moreover, Mr. Yates' uncle is about to be here. How can we let this guy sit with him? I'm out of here if he leaves. Don't say I didn't warn you," retorted Nancy. Her aunt instantly looked awkward. She looked at Mr. Yates apologetically with a smile on her face. Jason suddenly laughed and said, "It was just a suggestion, but it's all right since Miss Brand loves and protects her employees." "Don't be mad at her, Mr. Yates. Nancy was just promoted to general manager, so she might not be used to it yet," said her aunt. Chapter 240. Jason chuckled and said, "All right. But you should be mindful of your status, Miss Brand. My driver is not allowed to enter this room. The only way your employees will respect you is if you keep your distance. If you're too nice to them like this, it will be easy for them to develop a bad mindset and cross the line." "You don't need to worry about that," said Nancy. Wilbur thought about what Jason said. He could not believe that Jason actually made some sense, even if only a little. Suddenly, the waitress opened the door again and a middle-aged man with balding hair and a big belly slowly walked in. Jason hurriedly stood up and introduced Harold to everyone. "Everyone, this is my uncle, Harold Yates." Rowan hurriedly stood up and jogged over. She held his hand and said, "My goodness, I finally got to meet you. Thank you for making time for us out of your busy schedule. It really is our honor." Harold chuckled politely. He gently shook her hand, but immediately pulled his hand back after that. Jason welcomed Harold to have a seat. Joshua and May also hurriedly stood up. They bowed to Harold to show respect. Nancy slightly nodded in response. Meanwhile, Wilbur picked up his beverage to drink. Harold took a quick glance at everyone. He smiled when he saw how Nancy looked. It seemed that he was pleased with what he'd seen. However, he did not look friendly when he saw Wilbur frowning in utmost displeasure. Rowan noticed it and hurriedly said, "Sir, this is Nancy's driver, and he doesn't know the rules. Please don't mind him." "I see." Harold slowly sat down and gestured for Jason to sit down. Rowan hurriedly instructed the waitress to serve the food. Then, Rowan introduced Nancy's parents and herself in a friendly manner. Harold only nodded and smiled in response. His arrogant demeanor was ticking Wilbur off. Just then, the waitress started to serve the food. Harold said, "I didn't have time to come, but Jason said I should. He's my nephew, and this relates to his future marriage, so I have to show up." "Right. You should check for the sake of the children," said Rowan while smiling along. Wilbur felt puzzled. Why did Rowan seem more invested in this than Nancy's parents? "The girl is nice. She looks very beautiful, and I heard she just became a general manager. I'm quite satisfied with her." Harold shared his compliments with everyone. Rowan instantly looked overjoyed. She said, "You're right, sir. The girl has been smart and kind since she was a kid, and her looks speak for itself. Nancy and Jason are a match made in heaven." "That's true, but it will still depend on how they feel, right?" Harold laughed like a parent. "Nancy is up for it, so we have to see what Jason has to say," Rowan responded with a chuckle. Jason smiled gently and said, "Miss Brand is very nice. I like her a lot." "All right. It's settled then. This is an amazing day today." Rowan smiled like she had never did before. Nancy frowned and coldly asked, "You guys haven't asked about my opinion, have you?" "Kid, look at Jason. What objections do you possibly have? Agree, and so do your parents. What is your problem? Asked Roan. Wilbur chuckled when he heard that. Harold noticed Wilbur's behavior and instantly asked in a cold voice, Say, is the driver your relative? He's not, Ruan replied. Harold instantly looked angry. He asked, So, why is the driver sitting here? How can you allow a driver to sit at my table? Please don't be mad. Nancy was just too kind. She insisted on letting her driver join us. Ron hurriedly replied. Chapter 241. Harold calmed down a little after hearing that. He frowned and said, This is our first time meeting each other, and it's about the future of these children. I'll let this slide for Nancy's sake, but this will be the only exception. Yes, of course. Roan kept apologizing. Then she said, Jason, do you remember what I said about my son being in our town? Your uncle is present. So can you settle this now? She looked at them with an excited face. Wilbur had a sudden realization. No wonder Roan cared so much about Nancy's arrangement. This whole ordeal was related to her son's future. He shook his head when he thought of that and sundled in silence. Roan noticed it and immediately yelled at him. What's the meaning of that? I didn't mean anything. Wilbur did not want to argue in front of Nancy and embarrass her family, so he endured it. However, Roan was very defensive. She scoffed coldly and said, This is our family business. You should be glad to join us at this table. What is the meaning of that look? I'll let you know that my son has the capability to work in this town, unlike you, who is only a driver. I didn't say your son is incompetent, just relax, Wilbur said while shaking his head. Roan was about to explode again when Harold interjected. Calm down, don't bother arguing with the driver. It's inappropriate. Yes, you're right. She hurriedly sat down and smiled along with Harold. After seeing through her and scheme, Nancy stood up and said, I'm sorry, but I have some business to attend to. I need to get back to Seachertown. Let's go, Wilbur. He nodded and got ready to leave. He did not want to stay there any longer than he needed to. Roan hurriedly stopped Nancy by standing up and grabbing her. She asked, What are you doing? Do you know who he is? Jason is Harold's nephew. It's an honor that he likes you. So don't be ungrateful. There are rich men in the city, but will you be good enough for them? Nancy suddenly yelled. Enough. My marriage is my business. I don't need you to order me around. I'm doing this for your own good. What kind of attitude is that? Roan was displeased. Nancy's parents tried to convince her. Nancy, hurry up and sit down. Jason's uncle is here, so don't throw a tantrum. Wilbur did not know what to do because her family was falling apart right before his very eyes. Nancy suddenly grabbed Wilbur by the arm and yelled, I'll let you know that he's my boyfriend. We've been together since a long time ago. What? Roan was flabbergasted. She looked at Nancy and Wilbur with disbelief. Nancy's mother also seemed shocked. She hurriedly said, This is not the time for jokes. Jason is well known in our town, and Harold Yates is personally here. You better sit down right now. She indicated that Jason Yates and Harold Yates were not someone they could mess with and told Nancy to stop making a scene. Roan was enraged. She pointed at Wilbur while shaking in rage and said, I knew it. I knew you looked sway when I first saw you. This is just as I expected. How dare you try to hit on Nancy? Tell us now. What filthy ways did you use to seduce our Nancy? Wilbur was getting angry too. Furthermore, since Nancy used him as a human shield, he did not have to hold back anymore. He said, This is Nancy's business. Please let her decide on her own, all right? If your son is really capable, you don't need to rely on Nancy. Stop acting like you're doing this because you care about her. Why you? Wilbur's statement was right on the nose. She instantly shuddered from anger and felt like she could not breathe. Wilbur scoffed coldly and asked, Am I wrong? Suddenly, Jason stood up and slammed the table. He yelled angrily, Sit down, all of you. Roan was startled. She obediently sat down. But Nancy and Wilbur stood there and stared at Jason coldly. Chapter 242. Jason looked at them and said slowly, No one dared to disrespect me like that in this town. Your family will pay for what you did today. What do you want to do? Asked Nancy angrily. Jason scoffed and said, What do I want? You'll find out soon. I want this guy to kneel, beg, and apologize right now. I may still forgive you. It's not too late to beg for mercy. You sure have a wild imagination, Mr. Yates, said Wilbur casually. Jason looked pissed. Harold waved and asked, Enough. What is the meaning of this? Jason sat down angrily when he heard that, still locking eyes with Wilbur in their glaring. Harold frowned and spoke slowly. I'm not trying to judge, but this is such a mess. How can we show our faces in this town again after this humiliation? I'm sorry, sir. It's all this guy's fault. Nancy has nothing to do with him. She's just trying to throw a tantrum because of me, explained Ron hurriedly. She also blamed herself. She knew that Jason and Harold were very upset, and they were furious. If I offend these two, I can forget about my son's job. I might even jeopardize our future in this town. I can also forget about that small supermarket that I'm running. They can't be messed with, Ron thought. Harold's phone rang just as he was about to speak. He answered the call after glancing at it. He frantically stood up after a moment and said, We need a settlement for what happened here. Jason can't endure this kind of injustice. You all need to come up with a solution as to how to solve this right now. Then, he wanted to leave. Jason hurriedly asked, What's wrong, Uncle? The authorities are here for an inspection, answered Harold while he walked out. Jason walked out of the reserved room with him. He whispered, Aren't inspections supposed to be informed? Why weren't you informed this time? It's the authorities from the province, and they said it's a surprise inspection. Even the district wasn't informed. They are here in town, so I have to hurry up to make arrangements. Hurry up and go then. We don't want any trouble. That's of course. Remember, you need to make that Nancy brat apologize even if she didn't mean it. Otherwise, you'll be humiliated. And so will I. I got it, Uncle. I'll take care of that guy and I'm going to have my way with that girl. Jason looked malicious. He felt insulted. Harold shook his head and said, That brat dared to disrespect me. I'll take care of the Brents from now on. She thinks she's all high and mighty just because she became a general manager in the city. Huh? Then, he left in a hurry. Jason took a deep breath. He looked very menacing. No one was allowed to leave unless they gave him some form of settlement. First, he made a phone call. Those unemployed men who usually followed him around immediately rushed over. He scoffed coldly and walked back into the reserved room. Nancy was sitting down after the strong persuasion of her parents. Wilbur had no choice but to follow suit. Nancy decided to wait for Jason to return and make things clear. Then, she would leave with Wilbur. However, Wilbur knew things were not as simple as it seemed.